The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Harrington glared down at Robert Miller from behind his imposing bench. The small county courthouse had never been so silent, the kind of heavy silence that weighs on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Every eye was fixed on the disheveled man in the worn-out suit that hung loosely on his thin frame. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he stood alone, without an attorney, facing the formidable legal team from Crestview Pharmaceuticals. Their expensive suits and confident postures stood in stark contrast to Robert's humble appearance. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Robert's gaunt face. His eyes, once bright and full of life, now looked sunken and defeated. The wooden railing separating him from the gallery felt like the barrier between two worlds, one of privilege and power, the other of struggle and desperation. "Mr. Miller, you realize you're facing serious charges of fraud and theft. These allegations could result in up to 7 years' imprisonment." Judge Harrington's voice echoed through the hushed courtroom, each word falling like a hammer on Robert's shoulders. "How do you plead?" Robert opened his mouth to speak, his dry lips parting with effort, but before he could utter a word, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a thunderous crack. The sound reverberated through the room, causing several spectators to jump in their seats. A young man, no older than 19, rushed down the center aisle, his breathing heavy and labored, clutching a leather briefcase so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His face was flushed from exertion, tie askew, as if he had run for miles to get here. There was a wild determination in his eyes that caught everyone's attention. "Your Honor, please, I have evidence that will change everything in this case," the young man called out, his voice breaking with emotion, the words tumbling out between gasps for air. The judge's gavel came down hard, the sharp crack silencing the murmurs that had erupted throughout the courtroom. "Young man, this is a court of law. Who are you to interrupt these proceedings?" Judge Harrington's face had turned a dangerous shade of red, his patience clearly worn thin. The young man straightened his posture, adjusting his tie with a trembling hand, then walking purposefully toward the front. His footsteps echoed on the polished floor, each step more confident than the last. "I'm Ethan Miller, Your Honor, Robert Miller's son, and what I have here will prove my father is innocent." Robert's eyes widened in shock, his mouth falling open slightly. A muscle in his jaw twitched as he stared at his son, unable to believe what he was seeing. He hadn't seen Ethan in nearly 6 months, not since their last bitter argument when Ethan had walked out, slamming the door so hard that the framed family photo had fallen from the wall and shattered. "I never want to see you again," Ethan had shouted that night, his final words still ringing in Robert's ears during his sleepless nights. To understand how this father and son ended up in this courtroom confrontation, we have to go back 8 months earlier to where it all began, to a small apartment where a broken man was trying desperately to hold together the pieces of his shattered life. Robert Miller had once been a respected watchmaker with a small but successful repair shop in downtown Millfield. His gentle hands could coax life back into timepieces that others had declared beyond repair. The bell above his shop door had chimed cheerfully dozens of times each day as customers came seeking his expertise. His reputation for honesty and fair pricing had spread throughout the county, earning him the trust of collectors and everyday people alike. His wife, Sarah, had been the light of his life, a kindergarten teacher beloved by the community. She had a way with children that seemed almost magical. The ability to soothe tantrums with a soft word, to inspire curiosity with a simple question. When she walked through the playground during recess, children would flock to her like butterflies to a flower, their small faces tilting up in adoration. Together, they'd built a modest but happy life with their only son, Ethan, a brilliant young man with dreams of becoming a doctor. From the time he was small, Ethan had shown an uncanny interest in how things worked, whether it was helping his father repair watches or poring over medical textbooks far beyond his years. His bedroom walls had been covered with anatomical charts instead of sports posters, and he'd spent his summers volunteering at the local hospital rather than hanging out at the mall with friends. Their home had been filled with laughter and dreams. Sunday dinners around the oak table Robert had built himself, game nights where Sarah's competitive streak would emerge, and quiet evenings where each pursued their own interests while simply enjoying being together. They weren't wealthy by any standard, but they were rich in all the ways that truly mattered. But life has a way of dismantling even the most carefully constructed plans, of revealing how fragile happiness can be. 3 years ago, Sarah had begun experiencing unusual fatigue. At first, they'd attributed it to the demands of teaching, to the endless energy required to shepherd 25 five-year-olds through their first school experience. But when bruises began appearing on her arms and legs with no explanation, when she started running fevers in the evening that broke by morning, Robert had insisted she see a doctor. The diagnosis had come on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, an aggressive form of leukemia. The doctor had spoken in measured tones about treatment options, survival rates, and quality of life, but Robert had barely heard anything after the word cancer. He'd gripped Sarah's hand so tightly that she'd had to gently remind him to loosen his hold. The medical bills quickly devoured their savings like a ravenous beast. The treatment, chemotherapy, radiation, hospital stays had consumed more money than Robert had ever imagined possible. He had been forced to sell their beloved 2-story home, the one with the garden Sarah had nurtured for 15 years, the one where Ethan had taken his first steps, where they had marked his height on the kitchen doorframe each birthday. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, where Robert converted the living room into a makeshift workshop. The dining table became his workbench, the couch pushed against the wall to make space for his tools and equipment. The neighbors complained about the soft tapping sounds that sometimes continued late into the night as Robert worked overtime to pay for Sarah's treatments. Despite his best efforts, the bills kept mounting, an ever-growing pile of envelopes with red past-due stamps that Robert would hide whenever Sarah was feeling well enough to come out of her bedroom. Insurance covered only a fraction of Sarah's treatments, and the experimental medication that showed the most promise, a new immunotherapy that had demonstrated remarkable results in clinical trials, wasn't covered at all. Robert worked 18-hour days, his fingers growing stiff and his eyesight worsening under the strain of the delicate watch repairs. He developed calluses where there had never been any before, and the magnifying glass left a permanent red mark on his forehead. Regular customers brought him extra work, sometimes inventing problems with perfectly functional watches just to give him the repair fee. But their kindness, while touching, was a drop in the ocean of debt that threatened to drown the Miller family. Meanwhile, Ethan had put his education on hold, deferring his acceptance to the pre-med program at State University to help care for his mother. He took a job stocking shelves at the local grocery store overnight, coming home just as his father was leaving for the watch shop. They passed like ships in the night, exchanging tired nods and brief updates on Sarah's condition. "She ate a little soup today," Robert would say. "Her fever was lower this afternoon," Ethan might reply. Their conversations reduced to medical bulletins, their relationship strained under the weight of shared grief and exhaustion. Sarah passed away just 14 months after her diagnosis on a quiet Sunday morning while Robert had stepped out to pick up her prescription. He returned to find Ethan sobbing beside her bed, clutching her still warm hand. The experimental treatment they had finally managed to start, scraping together the money from loans and community fundraisers, had come too late. The funeral expenses had been the final blow to their already precarious finances. Robert had been forced to choose the most basic service, a plain casket that seemed so inadequate for the vibrant woman who had filled their lives with color. The funeral home director had been kind, but firm. Payment was required up front. The relationship between father and son had deteriorated rapidly after Sarah's death. Grief took different forms in each of them. Robert retreated into himself, working even longer hours, speaking less, sleeping rarely. Ethan, on the other hand, burned with a restless anger that needed somewhere to land. And increasingly, that target became his father. "You should have found a way to get that medication sooner," he had shouted during one particularly heated argument, his voice cracking with emotion. Fists clenched at his sides. "Mom might still be alive if we'd started the treatment earlier. You were too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to take out a bigger loan." What Ethan didn't know, what Robert couldn't bring himself to explain through his own grief, was that he had tried everything. He'd applied for medical assistance programs only to be rejected because they owned too many assets. The watch shop equipment counted against him, even though selling it would have destroyed their only source of income. He'd pleaded with insurance companies, spending hours on hold, only to be told by sympathetic but powerless customer service representatives that policy terms couldn't be changed. He'd even approached the pharmaceutical company directly, filling out application after application for their patient assistance program, only to be denied because they fell just above the income threshold despite their mounting debt. All doors had closed in his face, each rejection delivered with corporate politeness that did nothing to soften the blow. Robert had kept these struggles from Sarah and Ethan, not wanting to burden them with the knowledge of how desperately he had tried and failed to save her. Tell us in the comments if you've ever had to make an impossible choice to protect someone you love. 6 months after Sarah's death, with the apartment growing more silent and the distance between father and son widening by the day, Robert developed a persistent cough that he ignored for weeks, attributing it to stress and lack of sleep. The cough deepened, becoming a ragged hack that left him breathless. Still, he pushed on, taking cold medicine to mask the symptoms and carrying cough drops in his pocket. When he finally collapsed in his workshop, coughing up blood that spattered across the face of a vintage grandfather clock he had been restoring, Ethan had found him crumpled on the floor. Despite their strained relationship, Ethan had rushed him to the emergency room, his medical knowledge enough to recognize the severity of the symptoms. The diagnosis had come quickly: advanced pneumonia with complications from years of inhaling the fine dust particles from his watchmaking work. The doctor, a young woman with kind eyes that reminded Robert painfully of Sarah, had prescribed an expensive course of antibiotics and warned that without treatment, Robert's compromised lungs could fail. She had emphasized the urgency, explaining that the infection had already begun to spread and further delay could be fatal. "You need to start this medication today," she had insisted, writing out the prescription with a concerned frown. "Your immune system is already compromised from exhaustion and poor nutrition. I'd admit you, but I can tell from your face you won't stay." But there was no money left. Robert's health insurance had lapsed after he couldn't keep up with the premium payments. The medical bills from Sarah's treatment still arrived monthly, each one a reminder of their loss and the debt that would follow him for years. That evening, after being discharged from the hospital against medical advice, Robert had sat at his workbench, His breathing labored as he stared at the last valuable possession he had, his grandfather's pocket watch. He'd kept it in a small velvet box tucked away in his sock drawer, unwilling to even consider parting with it until now. The watch was more than just a timepiece. It was a masterpiece of Swiss craftsmanship from the 1920s, a Patek Philippe with an intricate gold case engraved with delicate scrollwork. The face was cream-colored with black Roman numerals, the hands blued steel that caught the light when they moved. Inside, the movement was a symphony of gears and springs, each component hand-finished to perfection. It had been passed down through generations of millers. From Robert's grandfather, who had received it as a gift from the nobleman whose estate he managed, to Robert's father, who had worn it only on special occasions, treating it with reverence. Robert had promised his own father on his deathbed that he would one day give it to Ethan, continuing the tradition. The watch represented everything that Robert valued: precision, craftsmanship, history, family. It was the physical embodiment of the legacy he had hoped to pass on to his son. "I have no choice," Robert whispered to himself, his voice rough from coughing, as he ran his thumb over the intricate engravings on the gold case. The watch could fetch enough to pay for his medication and perhaps make a small dent in their outstanding debts. The alternative, leaving Ethan an orphan with nothing but debts to inherit, was unthinkable. The next morning, moving slowly and pausing often to catch his breath, Robert had taken the watch to Anton Voss, owner of the city's most prestigious jewelry store. Voss Jewelers occupied a corner location in the wealthiest part of downtown, its windows displaying items that most Millfield residents could only dream of owning. The bell above the door chimed softly as Robert entered, a gentler sound than the cheerful ring of his own shop. Anton Voss, a tall man with silver hair and impeccable posture, had known Robert professionally for years. They had occasionally referred customers to each other, Voss sending watch repair work to Robert, and Robert directing clients looking for fine jewelry to Voss. There was mutual respect between them, if not quite friendship. Voss had examined the timepiece with expert eyes, holding it up to the light that streamed through the store skylight, opening the case to inspect the movement within. His expression revealed that he recognized its exceptional value immediately. "This is a remarkable piece, Robert," he had said quietly, closing the case with a gentle click. "A Patek Philippe from the early 20s in excellent condition. The movement appears to be original and well-maintained." He hesitated, looking up at Robert's pale face. "May I ask why you're selling it? This is a family heirloom, is it not?" Robert had nodded, unable to speak for a moment as another coughing fit overtook him. When he could breathe again, he had simply said, "Medical necessity." Understanding had dawned in Voss's eyes. The whole town knew about Sarah's illness and death. In a community the size of Millfield, such tragedies were common knowledge. "I can offer you $15,000, which is more than fair," Voss had said finally, naming a sum that would have seemed enormous to Robert just a few years ago. Robert knew the watch was worth at least twice that amount on the collector's market, possibly more to the right buyer. But he was in no position to negotiate, no position to wait for a better offer. The infection in his lungs felt like it was spreading by the hour. "I'll take it," he said quietly, feeling as though he was betraying his heritage, breaking the promise he had made to his father. The weight of that betrayal sat heavy on his chest, making it even harder to breathe. Voss had been efficient, preparing the paperwork and cash payment without unnecessary conversation. As he handed over the envelope containing 15 crisp $1,000 bills, he had said only, "I hope this helps, Robert, truly." That same afternoon, with the money secured in an envelope in his inside jacket pocket, Robert had gone directly to Millfield Pharmacy to fill his prescription. The familiar pharmacy, with its faded green awning and handwritten signs in the window, had been a part of Robert's life since childhood. The pharmacist, Harold Jenkins, was the third generation of his family to run the business, and he greeted Robert by name as he approached the counter. But Harold's usually friendly face had grown serious as he examined the prescription. After checking his computer and making a phone call, he had delivered devastating news. The antibiotic Robert needed was on backorder due to a manufacturing shortage. It wouldn't be available locally for at least 2 weeks. "There is one option," Harold had said hesitantly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Crestview Pharmaceuticals in the next county has it in stock, but their price is nearly triple what you'd pay here. Something about supply chain issues and increased demand. I've had several customers drive over there for emergency medications lately." Robert had felt the room spin, the fluorescent lights overhead blurring into streaks of white. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. He couldn't wait 2 weeks. The doctor had been clear. Without immediate treatment, he risked developing antibiotic-resistant pneumonia that could be fatal. The infection was already severe. "How much is it here, normally?" Robert had asked, his voice barely audible. With no insurance? Harold had checked his computer again. "Around $2,000 for the full course, but like I said, Crestview will charge much more." $2,000, a significant sum, but well within what he had received for the watch. There would be enough left over to pay some of the most pressing bills, perhaps even to make a small payment towards Sarah's medical debt. That evening, back at the apartment, the argument with Ethan had reached a breaking point. Robert had explained about selling the watch, about the medication being unavailable locally, about his plan to drive to Crestview the next day. Ethan's face had transformed before his eyes, grief and anger warping his young features into something almost unrecognizable. "That watch was supposed to be mine," he had shouted, color rising in his cheeks. "It was the one thing from our family that meant something, and you just sold it off." "Just like you sold Mom's jewelry to pay for treatments that didn't even work." Each word had been a knife twisting in Robert's heart. Yes, he had sold Sarah's jewelry, pieces she had explicitly told him to sell if needed. "They're just things, Robert," she had whispered during one of her lucid moments between pain medications. "Just metal and stones. You and Ethan are what matter." "I had no choice, Ethan," Robert had tried to explain, his voice weak from coughing, each word an effort. "I need the medication now, not in 2 weeks." "There's always a choice," Ethan had spat back, his voice rising to fill the small apartment. "You're just too weak to make the hard ones, too weak to fight the insurance company harder, too weak to stand up to the hospital billing department, too weak to save Mom." The last accusation had hung in the air between them, too painful to address, too raw to dismiss. Ethan had turned away, going to his bedroom and emerging minutes later with a backpack stuffed with clothes. "I'm done," he had said, his voice suddenly calm, which was somehow more frightening than his shouting had been. "I'm going to stay with Jake until I figure things out. Don't expect me back anytime soon." Jake Walsh was Ethan's best friend from high school, a computer science student whose parents had a large house across town. They had always welcomed Ethan, especially during Sarah's illness, when the Miller apartment had become a place of whispered conversations and medical equipment. The door had slammed with such force that a thin crack appeared in the drywall beside it, another small damage that Robert couldn't afford to repair. He stood alone in the silent apartment, clutching the envelope of money that had cost him both his heritage and his son. Would you have sold a family heirloom to pay for medicine? Share your thoughts in the comments. The next day, his fever higher and his breathing more labored, Robert had made a decision that would eventually lead him to that courtroom. He drove to Crestview County, each mile an effort as he fought to stay alert behind the wheel. Twice he had to pull over when coughing fits became too intense for him to see the road clearly. Crestview Pharmaceuticals occupied a sprawling modern facility on the outskirts of the neighboring county's largest town. The building was